Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 206, and we're going to talk about anti-free speech academics, or academicians, as they like to call themselves. Um, yeah, I gotta do an errand later tonight, so I'm going to try to squeeze in an episode before I have to take off and take my aunt to the airport. But at the middle school where I'm teaching right now, some of the kids, when they hear that my title is doctor, they'll say, "Oh, I'm sick. You're a doctor. Help me." You know, it's a corny joke. It's a middle school joke uh, made by kids who really don't understand the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, the PhD. Now, PhD, now I know what you're thinking, but PhD is a racialization too, right? A generalization based on a specific characteristic, such as PhD. Right. And so there are stereotypes of the PhD. Believe me, I know a lot of them. And I've met a lot of people who actually have given credence to the stereotypes of PhD. But there are many different kinds and different people, even with the same degree from the same department at the same school. Right. So where I was teaching, because, for me, it was sort of my side hustle, right? Because the church was my main gig, but it doesn't pay a lot. And so I look for another job that would be able to help me do my main job, right? So that I wouldn't have to continually ask the church to pay me more money, right? Because then it would small business. Remember my small business episode. So anyway, uh, so I would teach there, and there were other, because the general studies department, there's no tenure possible there. And so a lot of people who are basically waiting around to get a tenure track position, or this was the best opportunity that presented itself, they would go down and they would teach in the general studies department, right? The department which basically taught program which basically taught required classes for graduation, right? So it was awesome for people like me, people who couldn't get a job anywhere else, and perhaps people who are living up to the stereotype of what a PhD is. You'd be amazed some of the conversations that you would hear there. I was, befuddled. I was confused a lot because these were supposed to be really, really smart people. I expected everyone to be smarter than me, and I just could not plug into what they were talking about. So most PhDs, they study what they believe is important. They get their degree, and now a lot of people begin to think very highly of themselves. Some people have experienced it when they got their undergraduate degree, right? I remember after one semester of college, I went home and I was like, I'm college educated, right? Which was really silly, but that's kind of the attitude that you have. And the better the reputation of your school, the more that you feel superior to everybody else. Like, I don't know why I'm hanging out with you mere mortals. I go to an Ivy League school, et cetera, et cetera. And so these people, and so it's worse on the PhD level, right? So once they get their degree, do they pontificate? Do they believe they're the smartest person in the room? What do you do when everyone in the room has a PhD? Understand what I mean? Now, I would always joke around in my class. I would say, hey, so basically, what qualifies you to be an instructor at a university? And I would say dysfunction, right? So most people who go in the humanities for a PhD is because they got a problem. They got a problem. It's like a bad itch, and you got to scratch it. And the only way that you're going to be able to scratch that itch is if you get a PhD. You got to research the problem yourself, right? So basically, you have all these people who are basically dysfunctional, and they go to school to try to figure out why they have these problems. And then the school says, you're qualified now to teach undergraduates, right? And that's pretty much, the situation where most people who are teaching at the university are largely socially dysfunctional, psychologically dysfunctional, whatever. And that is the qualification for teaching. It's probably different in the sciences, but generally in the humanities, that's pretty much how it goes. My dad once told me he had a PhD as well, and basically he would say that a pastor has to be the most educated person in terms of knowledgeable about the world, scripture, etc. And so he said a PhD, all that is a license to write books. It's proof that you went through the intellectual academic training to do the proper research to be able to write books, or as I like to say, make knowledge. engage in knowledge production. Okay. So it's the license to basically make information for other people to consume. You still got to do the research, right? But hopefully your doctoral program trained you to see the angles, all the different possible interpretations, right? And so my personal position is always that uh, all we can do at the moment is accept what we think is true as the truth. But we're always looking for better information. In other words, we need to have an open mind and an open mind also for there to be an atmosphere of freedom of speech so you can hear better ideas, so you can humiliate yourself, so you can realize that you're not the smartest person in the room. You only know a small sliver of the entire universe, like a super insignificantly small sliver. But hopefully, in the process, you learned how to gain more information, how to prevent yourself from becoming locked in a box, right? But these days, more and more, what I begin to see in the humanities are, especially because the way the structure is set up, like you don't want to go through years of study and then all of a sudden not get the PhD, right? So what they do is they try to streamline the process to ensure that if you put a lot of years in the work already, that you'll get your PhD, right? You will be told right away if you're not going to cut it, if what you're planning on studying is not going to fly at this particular university. And so you go looking for another school. And they try to do that as much as possible. But once you cross a certain line, you have your committee, your ABD, then basically there's this sort of unwritten rule where the school is sort of obligated to help you graduate. Right. But that's already because you've already jumped through a lot of hoops. Um, but what I noticed in the humanities, because of this process, what they also did was is began being heavily influenced by what I believe is the Frankfurt School in postmodernism, right? And their basic approach is that you construct a narrative, you create a story, and you hook people through the story. And you find research, right? You research to find support for that story. So it's not necessarily that you've done a broad range of research, but you're going to do a targeted research to support that study. Now, before you lose your pants, it's kind of how science goes as well. The scientist, right? If you really understand scientific experiments, right, you can't have infinite variables. You have to control the number of variables in your scientific experiment, right? And so, say you have two variables or three variables or whatever, and adding each variable increases the number of scenarios that you have to entertain, research, look at, and everything becomes much longer, much more expensive. So the same deal is with the humanities. You have a very specific target, and now you're going to look for information which talks about it, supports what you're trying to say, and you downplay anything else. I've seen that happen a lot. I might have done it a little bit myself. So it's about creating a story to get people excited, get people hooked into it, and therefore buy into it, right? Sounds familiar. It should, because that's kind of the way a lot of lefties, right? And even some righties, for their own right-wing agenda, right? You're going to have a goal and then you're going to pitch it, emphasizing all of the ideas and all of the examples which support your idea, ignoring everything else. You see this similar phenomena in the stock market, not that long ago, when certain tech companies would go public, they were hyped up, right? There was a story that was told about them. I think it was also with the SPAC as well. And so what you see is a lot of people hyping up a story, a certain trend, and people get excited and they throw a lot of money at it, like WeWork, for example. It had a great story, and so a lot of people bought into the company. But ultimately, it doesn't last because a story is not good enough to float and keep maintaining a large perhaps billion-dollar business. It just doesn't work that way. So the hype becomes the substitute for substance, and this is what happens in scholarship as well. So people are so deep in their subjectivity, in their research, in what they are fixated on, that nothing else makes sense, right? So as long as you stay in that subjectivity, right, on the assumptions that you have, looking at your goal, everything is clear, right? The path that you have to take is absolutely clear. Anything that deviates from that path, you can't tolerate it, right? And so that's why I talked about yesterday I talked about the keyboard warriors, right? How they fixate on a subject and ignore everything else. Well, you see that in scholarship as well. And this is why censorship is so important, right? So you're trying to sell people on an idea. I don't know, call it reparations, if you will, right? So you're trying to get people, convince people, yeah, this is good, this is legit, this is moral, this is righteous. We have to do this. And you pitch it, and you only give them the positive aspects of that idea, right? You don't talk about the downside risk. This is what I talked about yesterday in Washington's farewell address, right? And in that subjectivity, in that narrow focus, other opinions, other views, that's misinformation. That's dangerous. It distracts people from what I'm trying to do over here, right? Uh, and so once you realize that when you listen to someone, you're basically listening to their subjectivity. You understand what they assume, you understand what they're looking at, and everything else becomes obvious. Like anything they're going to say, everything that they have said, anything that they've said behind closed door, you already know, right? Because it's very mathematical, right? I have my assumption, I have my goal, 2 points, I have the line, and so all the points on the line, it has to be consistent with what that person says. This is why it often doesn't follow normal logic, right? And so it's consistent to that argument, but it's inconsistent to other things that we already know are true. And so instead of having this deep, conversation about what might be possible, what could be, using this particular subjectivity, no, instead we're just going to remain on the level of cliche, of platitude, of these superficial throwaway remarks, which might mean something, which might sound good, but actually doesn't help us. It doesn't give us any information. So we're hiding stupidity with virtue. I'll give you an example. If we can just save one life, it's worth it. Oh, okay. Well, sure. I guess we can save one life, but at what cost? Right. And so I've played this game with people, especially those, people don't say it so much anymore. If we can just save one life, right? And people don't say that anymore because it's actually very silly, right? Because what if, so do I, murder other people so I can save one life? Do I go into massive debt so I can save one life? Whose life? Right? Is that life worth all these other people who are now deprived of resources because you spent it all to save this one life? Um, so we don't say that anymore. What we say instead is we must stop Putin at any cost, right? So at any cost, right? So we have to do this. We must stand with Ukraine at any cost, no matter the cost, right? And so it's this kind of thing. Now we have a goal specific kind of thing, right? So Putin is extremely evil. That's why it's worth it. It's the moral thing to stand with Ukraine. That's why we should do it. Stay in your house. You're killing your grandma, that kind of thing. So, you're going to make a, superficial, throwaway, meaningless pitch, but then you're going to couch it, right? You're going to frame it within all this virtue, right? At the same time, demonize people who don't want to do that. So looking at problems this way ignores cost. We all know this was going to come. We ignore consequences, right? So stand with Ukraine, because it's the moral thing. Okay, 600,000 soldiers have died. It's okay. Continue to stand for Ukraine. Nuclear war, fine. That's okay, because we have to stand with Ukraine. So this kind of mindset uh, blinds people to the actual consequences, the actual cost, right? And keep in mind that it's not just confined to the Ukraine, right? Where's all this money coming from? Who is getting fueled? What is getting fed as a result of this, right? All of the corruption that's happening, all the inflation here at home. So eventually, if you stick around long enough, the superficial arguments always have always become contradictory, right? So as I said yesterday with the Hunka reference, right? Anything anti-Russian is good. We're going to shove that in everyone's faces. Anti-Russia good. So even the Nazis and during World War II, that's good because they were anti-Russian. And I thought about it some more. I read a couple of other articles. Apparently, there is a very strong connection with the people who, in other words, like, for example, Trudeau knew that he was a Nazi and he invited him again to another party several months later after all the news died down, because that's just simply what they do, right? And so it's interesting, right, that all of this censorship, coerced, mandatory obedience to these random government edicts, that's very typically fascist, right? Another example is the anti-racists and people who are crying for reparations. They make pro-slavery arguments, and that's just how it is. When you are fixated only on a certain goal, and you incorporate Machiavelli here, where the ends justify the means, including hypocrisy, contradiction, well, then that's what you get. And so censorship keeps the game going, right? Because you're erasing the opposing view, right? So it's intellectual protectionism, right? Just like a tariff protects domestic industry from foreign competition, censorship is intellectual protectionism. You prevent people in the marketplace from hearing better ideas. And so people just only hear the one thing and they say, well, that must be the way it is. And I've done this many, many times. You just introduce an alternative, right? A simple alternative that allows people to keep their view, but also allows us to choose something else. It's very convincing. At least in the controlled environment I had in the classroom, I was able to make a lot of inroads into people who otherwise would have ignored me. So once you open up the doors, get people to at least be a little bit open-minded, or at least just hear you out, then that whole superficial argument that people make, the contradictory argument, it gets revealed and people begin to abandon it, right? Censorship allows people then to reward stupidity. Superficial arguments, I talked about that. Some people who disagree with me, but they make the most asinine arguments, but they don't feel the pain, right? No one is going to correct them because of the climate that we're living in. Life is not like that, however, right? So doing a keyboard warrior, making, superficial arguments, that's not life. Life always brings about unintended consequences. So if you want to do something real, you have to focus on a good principle, a good rubric for life, like freedom, for example. And freedom, then, if you prioritize freedom, then you get a lot of equality, which is what a lot of people wanted in the first place. And so a lot of other people, these superficial academicians, what they're going to do is they're going to say, no, 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 equality is more important than freedom. Freedom is dangerous. And so now you have neither. That's a Milton Friedman free market argument, right? If you prioritize freedom over equality, you get a fair measure of both. If you prioritize equality over freedom, you have neither. Okay. And so the problem is then you can't do this narrative approach to scholarship any longer, right? In order to be able to see the beauty and results of freedom, you got to let go, which is definitely not what authoritarians, what dictator wannabes want to do. They can't do that, right? You can't have that. So virtue signaling, temporarily at least, hides their true goal, right? And what is their goal? To destroy positive Western traditions, to replace it with their own. And I say Western traditions because it's generally happening here in the West. Marxism, communism, call it what you will, authoritarianism, fascism, control of the many by a small number of people. And so that virtue signaling will be so loud and so strong that, the followers, you know, because they're so in that subjectivity, better solutions would be in their face, but they refuse to see it. They refuse to see how contradictory, how hateful the ideas that they have are. They refuse to see it, perhaps because of their politics. Now, if only they really believed in saving one life, everyone's life, right, then we would probably have a different situation. So these days we have to fight the battles just to revert to the mean, right? So we're so far off the edge, right, where most of the ideas that people are promoting and supporting are unsustainable, but we have to fight these battles to just get back to the mean. But I have every confidence that the truth will out. And so I'm always hopeful, which is why I'm making these episodes to encourage you and to find your own way to reach and to talk to all of these other people who are trapped in those narrow subjectivities. That's it. I hope you have a great weekend. I'll talk to you next week.